Let's pause for a moment and talk about gentrification. It's a polarizing buzzword that often divides people into two camps. On one side, you have people who see it as a great across-the-board thing. The neighborhood gets cleaned up, crime goes down, and home values rise.
For millions of people my age, that is a dream.
Then on the other side, you have those who view it as a form of colonization and cultural erasure.
Gentrification is genocide.
But it's important to understand that gentrification doesn't begin maliciously. Let's use the US as an example. Hipsterism, as we know it today, began in New York City in the early 2000s. The first hipsters were suburban-raised millennials who adapted grunge and lumberjack fashion forms that were popular in Minneapolis and the Pacific Northwest in the late 90s. Most of the original hipsters were the grandchildren of white Americans who fled the inner cities in the mid-1960s during desegregation and a mass exodus known as white flight. The construction of newly built all-white suburbs and Levittowns and the farmlands outside cities like Philadelphia was more than a geographic resettlement. It was essentially a mass divestment from the cities, which resulted in a near total transferring of what Josue's interviewee calls purchasing power away from the urban centers into these private redlined communities. This, in turn, created half a century of economic apartheid, in which you basically had two parallel societies, the cities and the suburbs, existing in complete isolation from each other. Throughout the 80s and 90s, cities like Philadelphia, Baltimore, and New York City spiraled into chaos and disrepair, while suburbia and its sprawl became larger and larger, even connecting metro areas like Chicago and Milwaukee. But there was one problem that the architects of white flight didn't consider, which is the mass loss of what's called cultural capital that came as a result of isolation. The first generation born into a post-white flight reality were the boomers. It should come as no surprise that they loved it and appreciated it. After all, most of their parents were hard-scrabble World War II vets who grew up in a world with no suburbs, so a white picket fence in a big backyard was like a utopia. The children of the boomers, Gen Xers, kind of liked the suburbs, but were showing some signs of angst. But the generation after them, the millennials, they envisioned a vibrant new life, a world beyond cul-de-sacs and strip malls. Put simply, they wanted to be around culture, eat interesting food, hear different languages, and just not be bored. And so a migration called reverse white flight began. It's generally acknowledged that the first hipster neighborhood in America was Williamsburg, Brooklyn, a historically Jewish, Black, and Dominican area where Vice moved their headquarters in 2001. The complete cycle of turning parts of the neighborhood from diverse cultural corridors to flat corporate business parks took about 15 years. And there's actually a science to how gentrification works. Tulane University professor Richard Campanella broke it down into a 4-phase model. Phase 1 is the arrival of starving artist types, legitimate, penniless, as he calls them, gutter punks, because he's from New Orleans, who are looking for a cheap place to live that's a reasonable commuting distance from upscale cultural centers. These types are often troubled. They use drugs and drink heavily, and for certain, never open any businesses, and so don't actively displace anyone. What they do, though, is signal safety that makes way for the arrival of Phase 2. Phase 2 is hipsters, but Campanella calls them the creative class. Those in the creative class fetishize the starving artist types, and are often semi-transient, meaning they kind of follow cool around the country. Unlike the broke Bohemians, hipsters are typically college-educated, hyper-liberal, and usually open businesses, like coffee shops, organic food stores, juice bars, yoga studios, barber shops with exposed brick inside, vegan co-ops, and essentially introduce oat milk to the hood. Gradually, the area becomes a colony of the greater hipster network and begins seeing cross-traffic from cities like Portland, Oregon, who begin imposing their aesthetics and cultural customs onto the area. However, rent and cost of living itself does not actually rise until the third phase begins, which Campanella calls the bourgeoisie bohemian phase. This is marked by the arrival of art collectors, people who refer to themselves as socialites, Burning Man camp leaders, cultural investors, and most importantly, real estate developers with a taste for the hip, who are aware of the area's skyrocketing cultural capital and see a massive business opportunity, which often takes the form of a city-sponsored arts district. It's between phase 2 and 3 that you find the most tension, because that's when the displacement happens. In this phase, entire neighborhoods are often bulldozed to make room for luxury hotels, trendy fine dining restaurants, and hip corporate storefronts, resulting in unaffordability for both locals who are totally out of this coolness matrix, and the hipsters and bohemians that made the area cool in the first place. After the shiny new apartments are built and the landlord raises the rent, the fourth phase begins, which is the arrival of the rich, the young professional class, like tech bros and finance guys who have absolutely no interest in anything cool and view cultural capital as basically meaningless. By the time phase 4 is complete and yuppies have taken over, you're left with a sterile, metallic ghost town full of empty apartments that basically nobody wants to live in. The developers who banked on the cool factor are bummed bummed, and the cycle of gentrification has now restarted on the outer radius of where it began, spreading like a nuclear bomb in all directions, destroying everything in its wake. In New York, you could say the bomb was dropped in Williamsburg. The blast radius is currently incinerating Bushwick, Bed-Stuy, Ridgewood, and further out into the boroughs. In Mexico City, it's safe to say the G-bomb was dropped in a neighborhood called Roma Norte, a historic district just southwest of the center of town. I'm not sure if you know this, but Mexico City is unbelievably large in size and has a higher population than New York. So there was a ton of neighborhoods for transplants to choose from. But Roma Norte's primary cultural appeal was its food. It's been a hotspot for Mexican cuisine since the 1950s.